Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Competing Biblically, the Foundation. Nick and Seth back with you guys again. And today we're talking about a topic I think a lot of us will enjoy, and a lot of us think on the surface that we have a good version of this, but may realize we have some work. And that is the topic of great passion.
Let's go.
And I think there's a lot of people when they participate in sport as Christians, they think that our passion needs to be held in, like we need to withdraw our passion. And I think we mistake Jesus for someone who wasn't passionate. And yet our passion doesn't need to be held back or held in, but it does need to be reshaped and transformed into the image of Christ. And we look to Jesus in the way that he demonstrated that great passion, as you were going to talk about in the Garden of Gethsemane.
Yeah. So before we get to the Garden of Gethsemane, we're going to look quickly at Hebrews 12, 1 and 2. So Hebrews 12, 1 and 2, it opens up. The writer of Hebrews says, therefore points back to all of like the hall of faith, people coming before. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and sin that clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race set before us, looking to Jesus, the author and founder and perfecter of our faith, who, for the joy set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. So this idea of Jesus, with the joy set before him, he endured the cross. We look back to last week and we talked about a strong will. And there's no place like we can see a strong will done better, and I don't even think we mentioned this in the video, but a place where we see it better displayed than Jesus saying, not my will, but yours be done. Praying and asking if there's any other way, not my will, Lord, but yours be done. If there's any other way, let this cup pass for me. But nevertheless, it's not what I want, it's what you want. And we see here in Hebrews 12, it's the same thing that Jesus is saying. It's saying about Jesus that with the joy set before him, he endured the cross. It takes passion to fulfill the will of the Lord. I mean, it says like that Jesus set his face like Jerusalem. Sent his face like flint towards Jerusalem. He knew where he was going. He knew what he had to do, and he was ready to fulfill the call of God. He was ready to do the will of God. Even to the point, like when you look at the life of Jesus, he would say things like, I have food that you don't know about. My food is to do the will of him who sent me. He was so passionate about achieving what God had given him to achieve, doing what God has called him to do, being who God had called and purposed him to be, that even approaching not just death on a cross. So like when we think of the cross, it's not just the cross. It's not just the torture. It's not just being executed, but the judgment of God that was going to come, the wrath of God that was going to come. And then on the back end of it, out of obedience, he knew that he would be seated again at the right hand of his Father, that everything that he had laid down and emptied himself of it, that he talks about in Philippians 2, all the rights and privileges. I mean, even during the cross encounter, he says, like, I could dispatch legions of angels at any point. Like, he could have taken himself off the cross at any point during this whole thing, yet he was so passionate about fulfilling the Lord's will. He was so we talk about that. It's got to be God's way. It's got to be God's power, and it's got to be God's glory. He was so committed to God's way that he would even, with joy, pursue his own substitutionary death on the cross for us. Yeah.
I mean, talk about God or Jesus enduring the cross for the joy set before him. I think of as an athlete, how much you endure, you go through for the joy or the passion of the game or of the sport or of competition. I think, again, 1 Corinthians 9, I think of, they do that for an earthly crown. We're willing to do that for something that's temporary and fleeting. How much more should we be doing it for a heavenly, an eternal crown? One that can't be taken away, that will last even beyond our very lives.
Yeah, so when I was wrestling growing up, I was so focused. I would only sign up, like I would get the tournament sheets as a little wrestler, and I would just look to see what the trophy size was.
Mm-hmm.
And then recently I just threw all those trophies away because my wife didn't think it was appropriate for a 35-year-old man to have a bunch of wrestling trophies from when he was 8, 9, 10, 12 years old. And then they have no value to me anymore.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think of going back to, I don't know if we talked about it on the video series. We've definitely talked about it on the podcast. Eric Liddell. Like this comparison to Eric Liddell and another runner during that time is that Eric Liddell said that I feel God's pleasure when I'm running. Like I am worshiping while I'm running. Versus this other guy, Harry, I think it's Harry Abrams. His view was, I have worked all my life for this 10-second race. And these 10 seconds will define who I am. Where Jesus had eternity in mind. He had the passion and perspective of eternity, of where he was going and what this light and momentary affliction for us, substitutionary punishment for him, but he knew what was on the back end of it. He knew the relationship that would be reunited between him and the Father and for us. And then we get to run for that type of prize as well. I love that illustration in 1 Corinthians, Seth.
Yeah, and the upward prize, I mean, you look at Philippians 3. So a cool fact, and Nick, you actually taught me this a while back, as we look at Philippians 3, Paul is talking about how he used to persecute the church. So he was seeking out to kill Christians while he thought he was following God at the time. But the people of the way, the Christians, he would go out to persecute them. And then God reaches out to him, changes his life, and now he began to serve him in people all over the known world. And so in verse 6, you see that word persecute, where he said, I was a persecutor of the church. And then later in verse 12 and 14, you see him using this phrase that's translated as press on. I press on to make it my own because Jesus Christ has made me his own. And then verse 14, I press on toward the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Jesus Christ.
That's good.
And that verb for persecute and that verb for press on are the same in the original language. They're the same word. But what has happened in between those two phrases from verse 6 to verse 12 is there's a change. God changed him personally, but then his passion didn't leave. His passion didn't go away when he knew Christ. But it was transformed to be made holy and righteous and for God's work. So as believers, what is the upward call of God in Christ Jesus? What are we called to? And that is that God can use sport as a vehicle to conform us to his image. We talk about closing the gap between potential and performance. That's our walk with him, and then on mission with those around us. That sport can become a mission field for us to reach others. And my passion is no longer just for me to get recognition or status or glory or awards and accolades, but now my mission is to represent, worship, and serve and lead others in a relationship with Christ. That becomes our new goal. And we're going to talk about this more, but this foundation where we talk about whole heart, new mind, strong will, great passion, it bleeds through to these other principles that are in the podcast, in the Competing Biblically framework that we aren't going to get to in this video series, but things like belief versus unbelief, selfishness versus selflessness, unity versus disunity. So this passion is not taken away. I coach now, and I have more passion for what I do related to soccer than I did before, but it's totally different. My passion is not to get attention or accolades for myself, but I see how God can and is using my participation in the sport to grow me and grow others around me. And that's what that redeemed passion looks like.
Yeah, and even ultimately, the passion is, so when we use these phrases, so other folks that use a similar philosophy, they call it 2x4, according to God's word, by his power, for his glory. We say God's way, God's power, God's glory. In verse 6 there, he says, he's building a case of everything that he's done, Philippians 3:6, of why he had an impressive resume. So he starts off, it's a little like, it's not quite a humble brag, but it's like an intentional, like, hey, if you think you have a reason to boast, I have more.
Yeah.
And now I count that as loss. But in that boasting, he says, as to my zeal, as to my passion, as to how on fire I was, and convicted and with conviction about what I was doing, I was a persecutor of the church.
Yeah.
That same, like you're saying, that same passion now it was still like, he was still concerned about God's glory, but he didn't understand God's way and he didn't understand God's power.
That's true.
Like, because he was lacking power, he was operating in the flesh, and he didn't realize that Jesus had not come to abolish their way of living, but instead to fulfill it or to make full the law. I mean, we were talking today as we were grabbing coffee that the law isn't bad. It's really, really good when being fulfilled by Christ and when we are empowered to go after it.
Yeah.
And then in the same way is like when we look at passion in the athletic world, I know it's one of the things that grieves my heart a bunch. And I had a revelation of this recently. My wife Lindsay and I, we went to a West Virginia football game. And there's this famous song that they play at West Virginia football games, Country Roads. Even though, just side note, not to burst any bubbles, I don't think that song was actually written about West Virginia. It's written about Western Virginia, the Shenandoah Valley, if you listen to the lyrics. But anyway, West Virginia clings to this song, and the writer plays it, as performed it there. But there was a faith FCA rally before the game, and there was an incredible worship band that was singing. And they did an incredible job. But as I looked around the room with these 300 kids who were at this game day event, there was a lack of passion. There was a lack of confidence. There was a lack of singing.
Yeah.
Like, we are coming before this God of glory, of power, of majesty. And just like the Apostle Paul, and for us, we want to put his glory on display. And they were just kind of just there. And then West Virginia goes and they play Iowa State, and they win in this dramatic fourth quarter comeback, back and forth, incredible game. And all of those kids, linked arms, hands on one another, swaying back and forth. They play this Country Road song at the end of every game when they win. But there was no one who wasn't engaged there.
Yeah.
Or just like you go to a Sunday morning service and we'll be quiet and subdued and calm. And I'm not saying you got to throw your running shoes on to go to church, or you got to lift your hands, or you got to scream. But when you're at a sporting event, I was at that game and West Virginia scored a touchdown. I'm high-fiving strangers. They win. We're hugging people. And I'm not even a West Virginia fan. We're just there because there's ministry going on campus and we know the people who are doing it and we wanted to spend time with them. Yet in the church, when it comes to things of faith, when it comes to applying our faith or integrating our faith in our sport, we don't have the same zeal that we have towards pursuing the traditional win of scoring more points or being better than or being recognized as. If we would do like the Apostle Paul has shown us here and like Jesus showed us in this passage, if we would abandon, if we would redirect, transform, and reapply the same passion and vigor, and closing this out with like you see the Apostle Paul do. He was zealous to persecute the church. He was also zealous for the mission. Yeah. So from going from imprisoning and killing people for the faith, he went to being imprisoned. They literally lock him, handcuff here, handcuffed to a guard, and he's like, great. This guy's going to know Jesus. And he evangelizes the guards to the point where he's making disciples of the palace guard. And then eventually he was passionate enough to the point that he was beheaded. Yeah. So he went from killing to being killed. He went from imprisoning to being imprisoned. And all of that so that God would receive glory. Yeah. Would we be able to do the same thing with others? Yeah. Would we pursue Jesus being made much of by making disciples, by doing things God's way, by doing things by God's power and with God's glory in full lens and effect.
Yeah. So, I think a practical way to end this conversation is our passion. And this coach, athlete, whoever you are, whatever your role in sport is, the passion that you have, that you feel, that you direct toward your sport, your competition, what does it look like for that to be redeemed or made to formed into the likeness and image of Christ? When we talked about the persecute, that Paul was zealous in persecuting the church, we can be so passionate about our sport and so passionate about going for the win that we tear down others that we see as our barriers to win, like others on our team, our coaches, or even tearing down the opponent rather than just competing against them. What does it look like for that redeemed passion so that Christ can flow through you? So rather than those that are weak or tearing them down because they're a barrier to win, going in and being passionate about making them the best that they can be. And what does it look like about caring for the people around you as whole people, not just people that can serve you in your sport to help you win, but caring for them as a whole? And these are questions we start to think about when we talk about redeemed passion. What does it look like to be passionate? But believer who plays in sport, please don't mistake your faith for thinking that you are not allowed to have passion on the field. We are called, Jesus has called us to be passionate followers of him, but it needs to be done his way and by his power and for his glory. Not passionate about us or what we want or our way, but passionate about his way. That's what he's called us to do. So some things to think about. I hope we have, you guys have some time to talk about them in groups with discussion questions. And we will be back here next week to recap all of this together.